The alien pirates thought it was easy money. They cut through the human freighter's hull with diamond-edged saws, laughing at how weak humans were. But the moment that airlock hissed open, the laughter died. The air hit them like liquid fire. Their armor didn't just crack, it melted. And from deep inside that ship, something ancient, something alive, something that had no name in any alien language, began to move toward them. Like this video, subscribe to HFY Endurance Tales, and drop a comment right now saying, "We are the biohazard," because this story is going to change how you see humanity forever. Now buckle up, because we're going inside that ship. The Sovereign Reach was not a warship. Nobody looking at her from the outside would have thought twice. She was a mid-class human cargo freighter, roughly 400 meters long, with a scarred hull that had seen decades of deep space transit. Her running lights blinked slow and steady, her engines were at minimal thrust. To any passing vessel, she looked exactly like what her transponder claimed, a routine supply run from the Mars orbital stations to the outer colonies near Kepler's belt. That was exactly what Commander Dale Mercer wanted the universe to think. Dale was 53 years old, built like a man who had spent his entire adult life doing hard physical work in low-gravity environments. Wide shoulders, thick forearms, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from concrete. He had served 12 years in the United Earth Merchant Marine before taking a private contract hauling specialty cargo for a company that didn't put its name on public manifests. He wasn't the kind of man who talked much. He didn't need to. His crew of 11 were just like him, quiet, experienced, professional. They were currently sitting in the mess hall on Deck 3, playing cards, drinking coffee so strong it could strip paint, and absolutely not worried about the 3 Vethkai pirate vessels that had been shadowing them for the last 6 hours. "They're still holding at 8 kilometers, said his first officer, a lean man named Travis Cole, not looking up from his hand of cards. Ran their transponder IDs through the database. All 3 are registered as Vethkai Freebooter class. Probably out of the Scarran Nebula corridor. Dale took a slow sip of his coffee. How long before they make their move? They've been running a standard encirclement pattern. Textbook stuff. Travis finally looked up. They think we don't know. Let them think that. Across the table, a broad man named Hank Briggs shuffled his cards without expression. Hank was the ship's chief engineer, and he had a habit of staying very still when things were about to get complicated. "The organisms are stable?" he asked quietly. "Checked them myself an hour ago," Dale said. "All 42 containment cells, every single one is sealed, cataloged, and exactly where it's supposed to be." Hank nodded slowly. "And if the Vethkai breached the hull?" Dale set down his coffee mug. He looked at Hank with the calm expression of a man who had already thought through every possible outcome and made his peace with all of them. "Then they'll find out why no species in the known galaxy has ever successfully boarded a human vessel twice." Nobody laughed. Every man in that room had read the classified incident reports. Every man in that room knew exactly what was stored in the sealed cargo bays 3 levels below their feet. The Vethkai didn't know. And that difference, that single critical gap in knowledge, was about to become the most important thing in the universe. 600 kilometers away, aboard the lead Vethkai vessel, Crimson Tide of Scarran, Freebooter Commander Vraxil was giving his boarding party final instructions. Vraxil was a large specimen by Vethkai standards, nearly 2.5 meters tall, with 6 articulated limbs, a chitinous exoskeleton, the color of burnt copper, and compound eyes that could process 17 distinct visual spectrums simultaneously. He had raided 43 vessels in his career. He had never lost a crew member on a boarding action. He considered himself, without irony, the finest pirate commander operating in the outer corridors. "The freighter is slow, unarmed, and crewed by humans," he told his boarding party of 20 warriors, his translation vocalizer rendering his clicks and hisses into galactic standard. "Humans are soft, weak. Their ships are built for comfort, not combat. We cut through the secondary airlock on the lower port hull, neutralized the crew, and stripped the cargo bays. We will be back aboard the Crimson Tide within 2 of their hours." His warriors clicked their mandibles in agreement. Standard boarding armor, Atmospheric filters set for low oxygen environments because humans prefer thin, barely breathable air. He clicked what passed for a laugh among his species. Pathetic creatures. They can barely survive their own planet. Not one of his warriors questioned this. Why would they? Every piece of Vethkai intelligence on human vessels said the same thing. Humans were biological weaklings who compensated with technology. Remove their technology, and they were nothing. The intelligence was wrong. It was wrong in a way that no Vethkai sensor array, no spy network, no captured human crew member had ever been able to accurately communicate. Because the beings who had encountered the truth firsthand had never made it home to report it. In the cargo bays of the Sovereign Reach, behind 30 centimeters of reinforced containment plating, 42 living things that had no name in any alien language stirred in their sealed cells. They could not see, they could not hear. But, in whatever way such organisms perceived the universe, they were aware that the pressure differential on the outer hull had changed. Something was coming. And deep in their ancient mindless biology, something that functioned like hunger began to wake up. Dale Mercer refilled his coffee, looked at the sensor readout on the mess hall wall panel, and said very quietly, to no one in particular, "Here we go." The cutting began at 0247 ship time. Vroxiel's lead boarding team, 8 warriors in heavy chitinous armor, reinforced with Scaran alloy plating, applied their plasma cutters to the lower port hull of the Sovereign Reach with practiced efficiency. The metal peeled back in clean arcs. Sparks drifted into the vacuum and died. Within 11 minutes, they had a breach large enough for 2 warriors to pass through simultaneously. Vroxiel himself stayed aboard the Crimson Tide, coordinating. His field commander, a veteran raider named Ges Vorak, led the boarding party through the breach and into the airlock buffer zone, a narrow pressurization chamber between the outer hull and the ship's interior. "Outer seal breached," Ges Vorak reported through the comm. "Entering pressurization chamber now. Atmospheric filters online. Proceeding to inner door. Efficiency noted," Vroxiel replied. "Proceed." Ges Vorak placed his cutting tool against the inner airlock door. The seal hissed, the locking bolts disengaged, and the inner door swung open. The air hit them like nothing in their combat training had ever prepared them for. It wasn't thin. It wasn't barely breathable. It was dense, heavy, and saturated with a concentration of molecular oxygen so far beyond anything the Vethkai atmospheric filters were calibrated for that the filters simply failed to register it as a threat. Because in the Vethkai understanding of biology, oxygen at that concentration wasn't a toxin. It was just air. Therefore, it was harmless. What the Vethkai did not know, what their intelligence had catastrophically failed to account for, was that the Sovereign Reach was not running standard human atmospheric conditions. Dale Mercer had quietly pressurized the entire ship to 38% oxygen concentration 6 hours ago. The moment he confirmed the pirates were following them, 38% was above standard human comfort levels, but well within human physiological tolerance. For humans, it meant slightly sharper thinking, slightly faster reflexes, a faint metallic taste in the back of the throat. For Vethkai chitinous exoskeleton, which was composed primarily of a complex organic polymer called sclerotized keratin, 38% oxygen was approximately equivalent to being slowly submerged in industrial oxidizing acid. A faint discoloration along the joints of Ges Vorak's left forearm plating, where the armor seal met bare exoskeleton. A slight darkening, a thin thread of smoke, barely visible. Then Warrior Prethgal, second in line, said something in Vethkai that the translation vocalizer rendered as, "My arm. Something is wrong with my arm." Ges Vorak turned. Prethgal's right shoulder plate had developed a spreading dark stain, the surface pitting and flaking in a way that Scaran alloy simply did not do under any condition Prethgal had ever encountered. As Ges Vorak watched, a piece of the plating, a piece of armor rated to withstand plasma cannon fire at close range, crumbled away like ash. Beneath it, the bare exoskeleton underneath was smoking. "Atmospheric anomaly," Ges Vorak reported, his voice carefully controlled. "Filters may be malfunctioning. Requesting technical assessment from..." Then the smell reached them, and every HFY warrior in that corridor stopped moving. To human senses, the interior of the Sovereign Reach smelled like any working ship: coffee, machine oil, recycled air, the faint ghost of whatever Hank Briggs had cooked for dinner. Normal, unremarkable, human. To HFY olfactory receptors, which were roughly 40 times more sensitive than human equivalents, it smelled like the inside of a chemical processing facility running at maximum output. The iron compounds in the ship's ventilation residue, the volatile organic compounds from the coffee, the microscopic aerosols from 11 human bodies going about their daily routines, shed skin cells, exhaled metabolic byproducts, the chemical signatures of a species whose entire biology ran on processes that produced, as casual byproducts, compounds that were acutely toxic to half the known galaxy. Gesvorak's second-in-command, HFY warrior Kospren, took one full breath through a filter that was rated for low-oxygen environments but had never been tested against the specific cocktail of human biochemical output, and immediately doubled over, his filtration membrane overwhelmed. Gesvorak, Vraxiel's voice came through the comm, sharp with the first edge of something that wasn't quite concern, but was adjacent to it. Report. What is happening? Gesvorak looked at his boarding party. 3 of his 8 warriors were already showing visible armor degradation. The corridor walls of the Sovereign Reach were utterly normal. Clean metal, standard lighting, completely unremarkable, and yet standing in it felt like standing in the middle of something deeply, fundamentally wrong. The ship's atmosphere is not what our intelligence indicated, Gesvorak said carefully. Clarify. Gesvorak paused, because he genuinely did not have the vocabulary in any language he spoke to accurately describe what was happening to his armor. It is eating us, Commander. The air is eating us. A long silence from the Crimson Tide. Then, from somewhere deeper in the ship, from somewhere past the second corridor junction, past the sealed door at the far end of the boarding entry deck, came a sound. Not an alarm. Not a weapon charging. Not boots on metal. Something moved. Something large and liquid and wrong in a way that bypassed rational analysis and went straight to the ancient instinctive part of the brain that exists in every living creature in the universe. The part that says, without words, without logic, run. Gesvorak had raided 31 vessels. He had faced armed resistance, vacuum breaches, and once a ship that had deliberately triggered its own reactor to avoid capture. He had never, in 31 raids, felt the specific quality of fear that settled into him in that moment. He clicked his comm. I think something else is aboard this ship. And in Containment Bay 7, 3 levels below, the seal on Cell 14 developed a hairline crack, too small to trigger the automated alarm, large enough to matter, and a thin thread of something colorless and alive began to seep into the recycled air of the Sovereign Reach. Whatever happened next, the HFY had just run out of the option of leaving quietly. Dale Mercer knew about the crack in Cell 14 before any alarm went off. He knew because Hank Briggs had been watching the containment sensors on a personal monitor strapped to his forearm since the moment the pirates began cutting through the hull. And Hank had the kind of relationship with his instruments that other men had with old friends. He noticed changes before the readouts formally registered them. Cell 14 is seeping, Hank said, his voice carrying the specific flatness of a man reporting a fact he had hoped he would never have to report. Microfracture in the secondary seal, probably vibration from the hull breach. Dale set down his coffee for the second time that night. This time, he didn't pick it up again. Containment protocol? Automatic isolation kicked in. The cell is sealed from the main bay now, but the seep already hit the ventilation return on Deck 4. It's in the air circulators. The other men in the mess hall absorbed this information with the stillness of people who understood exactly what it meant. Travis Cole laid his cards face down on the table. How long before it reaches the boarding entry deck? Ventilation cycle on that section runs every 4 minutes. Hank checked his monitor. 3 minutes ago was the last cycle. Everyone did the math simultaneously. We need to move, Dale said. He was already standing, already moving toward the door with the unhurried efficiency of a man whose body had internalized the principle that calm speed saved more lives than panicked running. Full biological containment posture. Masks on, gloves on, sealed suits. Nobody touches anything in the Deck 4 corridor without checking the sensor first. And nobody. He paused at the door and looked back at his crew with an expression that carried the full weight of his experience. Nobody opens a containment cell manually, for any reason, under any circumstances. Are we clear? 11 men said clear in 11 different ways, all of them meaning exactly the same thing. They split into pairs and moved through the ship with the practiced coordination of a crew that had run this drill before, because they had. Dale had made sure of it. Every man aboard the Sovereign Reach had been through biological containment training twice before departure. They had all read the incident reports from the 3 previous vessels that had carried this particular cargo. They all knew what the organism in Cell 14 was capable of. 3 levels below, in the boarding entry corridor, Ges Vorak's situation had deteriorated from alarming to critical. 2 of his 8 warriors were no longer standing. Their armor had degraded past the point of structural integrity, and without the armor's environmental sealing, their bare exoskeletons were being exposed to the ship's atmosphere directly. The oxidation process on bare Vethkai chitin was faster than on armored plating. Significantly faster. Warrior Prethgal had made it back through the inner airlock door and was trying to reach the outer hull breach when his left leg joint failed entirely, not from a weapon, not from impact, but from the simple, relentless chemistry of a 38% oxygen atmosphere reacting with biological material it had spent no evolutionary time developing tolerance for. He fell against the wall. He did not get up. Ges Vorak was still standing because his armor was newer, the seals tighter, the material slightly higher grade. But he could feel it, a deep pervasive burning along every seam and joint, a sensation his species had no precise word for, because they had never needed one. He had his warriors grouped at the far end of the corridor, away from the inner door, running rapid damage assessments, and trying to determine if any of them had a viable path back to the hull breach. Then the ventilation grill on the left wall, a standard, unremarkable ship vent about 40 centimeters square, exhaled its 4-minute cycle, and the air changed. Not dramatically, not with a visible cloud or a detectable color shift. The change was molecular, submicroscopic. Something that had been absent from the corridor's air was now present in it. Not in large quantities, not yet, but present in the way that a single match is present in a room full of dry paper. Technically harmless. Technically. Ges Vorak's atmospheric sensor read the change and flagged it as an unknown compound. No match in its database. No hazard classification. No recommended response. Unknown. That was the last reading Ges Vorak's sensor took before the organism, following the ancient mindless biological imperative that was the only thing driving it, made contact with the sensor's external casing and began to feed. Commander, Ges Vorak's voice had changed. The careful professional control was still there, but underneath it was something that didn't belong. A quality that Vrak Seal, listening from the Crimson Tide, had never heard in his field commander's voice in 31 raids together. There is something else in this corridor. Something I cannot identify. My sensor is no longer functioning. My warriors are. A sound. Not the warrior, not equipment. Something ambient. Something that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Report. Ges Vorak. When the field commander spoke again, his translation vocalizer was struggling to render sounds that had no clean equivalent in galactic standard. What came through was approximate. It said, "Commander, do not send more warriors. Whatever you do not send more warriors into this ship." Then the comm went to static. Vrak Seal stood at his command console, aboard the Crimson Tide, and stared at the static readout for 3 full seconds. Around him, his bridge crew were very still. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Everyone was waiting to see what the commander would do next. Vrak Seal's reputation was built on decisiveness. He made decisions fast, and he stood behind them. Not once, in 31 raids. He pulled up the external sensor feed from the hull breach camera they had placed before boarding, still transmitting from outside the Sovereign Reach's hull. The feed showed the hull breach, undisturbed, the cut metal edges, the darkness of the interior airlock beyond. Normal. Quiet. Except, Vroxiel loomed forward, along the cut edges of the hull itself, along the metal they had sliced through with diamond-edged precision tools. Something colorless and faintly luminescent in the infrared spectrum, moving outward from the breach opening, across the outer hull of the Sovereign Reach, in thin, branching filaments. Growing. "What," said Vroxiel's navigator, very quietly, "is that?" Nobody on the Crimson Tide had an answer. Inside the Sovereign Reach, Dale Mercer sealed his suit, checked his oxygen supply, and began walking toward Deck 4 with a flashlight, a biological containment kit, and the unhurried expression of a man who had already accepted that his night was going to be very long. He had one more thing with him, a small sealed canister, matte black, labeled in human text that translated roughly as emergency recall agent, authorized use only. He hoped he wouldn't need it. The organism had no name that humans used casually. In the classified documentation that Dale Mercer had been required to read, sign, and acknowledge before accepting this contract, it was designated XB7 acido-colonial substrate, a label so dry and technical that it communicated almost nothing about what XB7 actually was or what it actually did. The people who wrote those documents had chosen that language deliberately. Accurate language would have been harder to sign contracts around. What XB7 was, in terms that required no scientific training to understand, was this: a living organism, native to the deep methane ocean floors of Titan, that had evolved over hundreds of millions of years in an environment of extreme chemical hostility by developing the ability to metabolize almost any complex molecular compound it encountered. It did not have eyes. It did not have a nervous system in any conventional sense. It did not think. It ate, constantly. And it reproduced by division, every 40 minutes, under optimal conditions. Optimal conditions, it turned out, were approximately equivalent to the interior atmosphere of a human spacecraft. The reason XB7 existed in sealed containment cells aboard the Sovereign Reach was a subject Dale had not been briefed on fully, and had learned not to ask about. What he knew was that XB7 had significant legitimate research applications in breakdown of complex industrial waste compounds, and that certain organizations were willing to pay exceptional freight rates to have it transported between research facilities. He also knew, because this part was in the contract, clearly stated, that in the event of an unauthorized hull breach during transport, the organism's containment protocols were designed to allow controlled dispersal as a defensive measure. The phrase controlled dispersal as a defensive measure was, Dale had come to understand, the legal and logistical way of saying, if someone breaks into this ship, the thing inside will deal with them. He was now walking through Deck 4, following the containment sensor readings on Hank's monitor toward the ventilation return that had picked up the Cell 14 seep, trying to assess how far XB7 had traveled through the ship's air circulation system. The answer, according to the sensors, was further than it should have in the time available. "It's moving fast," Hank said, through the comm in Dale's earpiece. "Faster than the baseline dispersal rate from the incident reports." "Why?" "It found a food source. Something's accelerating its division rate." Another pause, longer. "Dale, the boarding party's armor compounds. Scaran alloy has a high-yield organic polymer matrix. XB7 would read that as basically a banquet." Dale processed this while walking. "So it's feeding on the pirates." "On their armor. Which means it's reproducing faster." Dale stopped at the Deck 4 corridor junction and looked at the ventilation grill on the wall. In the beam of his flashlight, the grill's metal surface had a faint, almost imperceptible luminescence. A thin biological film, barely visible, coating the metal in a layer thinner than paint. XB7, moving through the ship. "How contained is it?" Dale asked. The automated isolation sealed off the cargo bay sections. The forward crew sections are clean. It's primarily in the Deck 4 to Deck 6 range, the boarding entry sections. Hank's voice was measured. "Where the pirates are." Dale stood in the corridor and thought about this for a moment. Thought about Gesvorok's boarding party. 20 warriors in Scaran alloy armor, armor that XB7 would read as the richest possible food source. Thought about what XB7 did to complex organic polymers when it found them in sufficient quantities and had 40-minute reproduction cycles, and nothing to stop it. "Travis," he said into the comm. "Here," Travis Cole answered. "Get me a visual on the boarding entry section. Anything we have." "The internal cameras in that section went offline about 8 minutes ago," Travis said. "Something disrupted the sensor network. But I've got audio from the corridor junction mic on Deck 5. A pause. "You want me to put it through?" "Yes." What came through the earpiece was not the sound of combat. It was not weapons fire or the clash of armored bodies. It was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to listen to. A continuous, low, wet sound, like something large and liquid moving through a confined space, punctuated at irregular intervals by the metallic groan of structural material under stress. And beneath it, barely audible, the Veth Kai comm channel that Travis had managed to partially intercept. 3, maybe 4 voices speaking in rapid, broken patterns that the auto-translator rendered only fragmentarily. "Cannot move. The floor is. Guess Vorak is not responding. Guess Vorak. It is everywhere. It is on my." Then a sound that the auto-translator did not attempt to render because it had no category for it. He stood in the corridor for a moment, in the quiet of the undamaged section of his ship, and looked at the faint biological film on the ventilation grill, and thought about the 20 Veth Kai warriors who had boarded his vessel, thinking it was easy. He thought about the emergency recall agent canister in his hand. XB7 had a specific chemical trigger that caused it to retreat to its colony state, a compound developed by the research teams specifically for situations where the organism needed to be recalled after dispersal. One canister, released into the ventilation system from the correct point, would cause XB7 to cease active foraging and consolidate into a dormant mass that could be recontained. In theory, the incident reports were mixed on how reliably this worked after significant colony expansion. "Hank," Dale said. "Yeah. If I deploy the recall agent now, how many of the boarding party are likely still viable?" Hank was not a man who gave optimistic assessments. "Dale," he said finally, "the organism has been in active contact with Scaran alloy armor for approximately 22 minutes. At the reproduction rate it's currently running," another pause, "I don't think viability is the relevant question anymore." Dale looked at the canister, looked at the corridor, thought about 31 raids that Guess Vorak had completed and survived, and about the 32nd. He was not a man who wasted time on feelings that didn't change outcomes. He uncapped the canister, walked to the ventilation access panel, and began to think about logistics instead. Behind the sealed corridor junction door, 6 meters away, the sound of something large and liquid moving through a confined space continued, steady and patient and utterly indifferent to everything except the ancient, mindless biological imperative that was the only thing it had ever known. Outside the sovereign reach, on the ship's outer hull, the filaments of XB7 that had followed the breach opening outward into vacuum had encountered something unexpected. Vacuum, it turned out, did not stop XB7. It merely slowed it. And the outer hull of the 3 Veth Kai vessels, still magnetically docked to the sovereign reach for the boarding action, was now less than 40 meters from the leading edge of those filaments. And XB7's dispersal rate in low vacuum conditions, according to the incident reports, was approximately 3 meters per minute. Raxiel did not know this yet. He was about to find out. The first indication Raxiel had that his ships were in danger was not from his sensors. It was from his hull integrity officer, a young warrior named Teth Karen, who said, "Commander, there is something on the outer hull of the Crimson Tide." Raxiel crossed to the sensor station in 4 long strides. The external hull camera on the Crimson Tide's port side, the side facing the Sovereign Reach, showed him what Teth Karen had seen. Thin, branching filaments, barely visible against the metal, spreading across his ship's hull in the same patient, geometric pattern he had seen on the human freighter's breach edges. Moving. Definitely moving. Growing outward from the magnetic docking clamp connection point at a rate that, even as he watched, was visibly progressing. "Detach," Vroxeel said instantly. Commander, detach from the human vessel. All 3 ships, immediately. Magnetic locks disengaged. The 3 Vethkai vessels began to pull back from the Sovereign Reach on maneuvering thrusters. The distance between them and the human freighter growing, 5 meters, 10, 20, 50. Vroxeel watched the hull camera feed as they pulled away. The filaments that had spread from the docking connection point were already on his hull. Already present. Already, he could see it happening, frame by frame in the camera feed. Already beginning the slow, methodical process of chemical evaluation that preceded active feeding. How much is on us? He asked, his voice carrying the absolute flatness of a commander who had moved past emotion into pure operational assessment. Teth Karen ran the hull scan. The results came back in seconds. Teth Karen looked at them, looked at Vroxeel, looked back at them. It's on all 3 ships. The bridge went very quiet. Coverage? 0.3% of total hull surface on the Crimson Tide. Similar readings on the Storm Striker and the Pale Talon. Teth Karen's voice was careful. But it's growing. The coverage rate is approximately doubling he checked his timer. Every 42 minutes. Vroxeel did the mathematics instantly. 0.3%, doubling every 42 minutes. In 4 hours, his ship's outer hulls would be substantially compromised. In 6, the outer hull integrity would begin to fail. In 8, he stopped the calculation. 8 hours was not a relevant number. Hail the human vessel, he said. His communications officer looked up. Commander? Now. Aboard the Sovereign Reach, Dale Mercer was in the ventilation access corridor on Deck 5. Carefully deploying the recall agent into the air circulation system through a filtered injector that allowed him to release the compound without personal exposure. When Travis Cole's voice came through his earpiece. Dale, we're getting a hail from the lead pirate vessel. Vethkai Commander. He's requesting to speak with the ship's captain. Dale looked at his watch. Looked at the recall agent canister. Calculated timing. Tell him I'll be with him in 4 minutes, Dale said. He sounds... Dale, I've processed a lot of Vethkai comm signals. This one sounds like a commander who has realized he is not in control of the situation. Good, Dale said. Let him think about that for 4 minutes. He finished the deployment sequence, sealed the access panel, and walked to the bridge at the same unhurried pace he'd maintained all night. Travis was waiting for him. Hank was on his monitor. The rest of the crew were at their stations, quiet and professional. The Sovereign Reach hummed around them, completely undamaged, completely intact, going about her business. Dale sat down in the captain's chair, straightened his jacket, and nodded to Travis. The comm channel opened. This is Commander Vroxeel of the Vethkai Freebooters, aboard the Crimson Tide of Scaran. The translation vocalizer did an acceptable job of rendering the Vethkai commander's voice, but it couldn't fully flatten the quality underneath the formal words, the tight, controlled cadence of a being who was working very hard to sound authoritative and was not entirely succeeding. I wish to discuss terms. Dale leaned back in his chair. Commander Mercer, Sovereign Reach, what kind of terms? The organism your vessel has deployed. We require information on how to neutralize it. That's a significant request, Dale said. You boarded my vessel without authorization, Commander. Endangered my crew, breached my hull, damaged my cargo systems, and now you want me to help you. We will withdraw, immediately. All 3 vessels. We will make no further approach to your ship or any human vessel in this corridor. That's what you were going to do anyway, Dale said, the moment you understood what you were dealing with. A longer pause this time. When Vroxeel spoke again, the formal authority in his voice had thinned considerably. My ships are compromised. My boarding party. He stopped. What we require is the neutralization compound. Whatever your vessel used to recall the organism from its active state. We are detecting that the organism in the Deck 4 through 6 sections of your vessel has begun to consolidate, which means you have a recall mechanism. Dale gave him that. In exchange for what? Dale asked. I have told you. Full withdrawal. No further. You have 3 ships, Commander, approximately. Dale glanced at Hank, who held up both hands twice. Approximately 200 crew across all 3 vessels. You have a biological contamination on all three outer hulls that is currently at 0.3% coverage and doubling every 42 minutes. Dale let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. I don't need anything from you, Commander. What I'm trying to determine is whether you understand the situation you are currently in. The silence from the Crimson Tide was very long. We understand, Vraxiel said, and in those 2 words, something that had been the voice of a confident, experienced raider had become the voice of a being who had encountered a category of situation his entire career had not prepared him for. We understand completely. Then I'll tell you what's going to happen, Dale said. I am going to transmit to you the chemical formula for the XB7 recall compound. It is not a complex synthesis. Any ship's laboratory can produce it from standard reagents. You will use it to treat your hulls within the next 6 hours. You will then use the second formula I'm transmitting, the long-term sterilization agent, to ensure no viable XB7 colonies remain on any surface of any of your 3 vessels. This process will take approximately 18 hours total. He paused. And then you will take your fleet out of this corridor, and you will never come back. And if we comply, then your 200 crew members go home. Dale's voice was completely even. That's the deal, Commander. All of it. No negotiation. Another silence. Then transmitting acknowledgement. One more thing, Dale said. The warriors you sent into my ship. I know, Vraxiel said. Very quietly. Very finally. I know. Dale nodded, though there was no visual feed. Transmitting formulas now. Good luck with your hulls, Commander. And I'd recommend never boarding another human vessel. He paused. Actually, and here for the first time all night, something that wasn't quite a smile crossed Dale Mercer's face. I'd recommend never approaching one. He closed the channel. Travis looked at him from across the bridge. You really going to give him the recall formula? Already sent, Hank said from his station. Both formulas. They'll have clean hulls inside 18 hours. Travis thought about this. They just tried to rob us. Dale looked out the forward viewport at the 3 Vethkai vessels hanging in space, slowly moving away, their hulls carrying a biological film that was, at this moment, doubling its coverage rate with the patient indifference of something that had been doing this for 400 million years before humanity had even learned to use tools. Because 200 people dying on 3 ships accomplishes nothing, Dale said. And because every crew member who survives this and goes home and tells the story is one more reason the Vethkai never bother a human freighter again. He stood up. That's the deal that's worth making. He walked off the bridge toward the mess hall, where there was still coffee, and where 11 men who had spent a very long night doing their jobs very professionally were waiting. Behind the Sovereign Reach, the 3 Vethkai vessels turned and ran. Faster than their standard cruising speed, with a slightly desperate acceleration of ships whose commanders had recalculated every assumption they had brought into this corridor, and found all of them wrong. In the Deck 4 corridor, behind the sealed junction door, XB7 was consolidating. Responding to the recall compound in the ventilation system, the colonial organism was drawing its dispersed filaments back toward the Cell 14 seat point, a slow biological retreat, guided by the chemical signal Dale had deployed, orderly, methodical, and completely indifferent to the evidence of what it had done over the past hour and 20 minutes. Some things aboard the Sovereign Reach would need to be cleaned. Some sections would need biological decontamination. The breach in the hull would need patching. The ship herself was fine. She was always going to be fine. The repair drones finished patching the hull breach on the lower port side of the Sovereign Reach at 0619 ship time, roughly 3.5 hours after Guess Vorak's boarding party had cut through it. The patch was solid, the atmospheric integrity restored, and the weld lines were cleaner than the original hull work, because Hank Briggs's repair drones were, in his words, better at their jobs than whoever built this bucket. Dale Mercer signed off on the damage report, submitted the incident documentation to United Earth Merchant Marine Oversight through the encrypted relay, and poured himself a third cup of coffee that was, by any objective measure, too strong for any rational human being to consume at 6 in the morning. He sat in the mess hall and drank it anyway. Travis Cole came in 20 minutes later, dropped into the chair across from him, and said nothing for a while. That was one of the things Dale had always appreciated about Travis. He understood that not every silence needed to be filled. XB7, fully recontained? Dale asked finally. Hank finished the secondary sealing on cell 14 an hour ago. All 42 cells confirmed stable. The deck 4 and 5 sections are clear. Biological sweep came back clean. Travis poured his own coffee, looked at it, appeared to reconsider, and drank it anyway. The Deck 5 corridor junction is going to need new wall plating in 2 sections. Some of the XB7 feeding activity left marks in the metal. He paused. And we need to file a formal report on the organism's dispersal rate. It outpaced the incident report projections significantly. I know, Dale looked at his cup. It found a food source it hadn't encountered before. Scaran alloy. The research teams are going to want to know about that. Outside, through the small mess hall viewport, the stars of the outer corridor were as they always were, cold and vast, and completely indifferent to the events of the past several hours. The Sovereign Reach moved through them at standard transit speed, steady and unhurried, exactly as she had been doing before the Vethkai arrived, and exactly as she would continue to do after. The Vethkai fleet? Dale asked. Heading out of the corridor at maximum cruise. All 3 ships. They're running quiet. No comms traffic we can intercept. No signals at all. Travis paused. Hull treatment compounds for XB7 removal take about 18 hours to complete, as you told them. They'll be clean before they reach the nearest Vethkai port, if they followed the protocol correctly. They followed it, Dale said. Vrock Seal's a professional. He made the calculation the same way I would have made it. You respect him. Dale Mercer took another sip of his coffee. I respect the fact that he made the right decision when the situation changed, and he understood it. He paused. Doesn't mean I have any sympathy for what he came here to do. This was the part of the job that didn't make it into freight contracts, or incident reports, or the dry bureaucratic language of United Earth Merchant Marine oversight documentation. The part where a captain sat in his mess hall at 6 in the morning, and thought about 20 Vethkai warriors who had boarded his ship thinking it was going to be easy, and about what XB7 had done to them in the Deck 4 and 5 corridors over the course of an hour and 20 minutes, and about the fact that none of it, not the pirates' overconfidence, not the organism's efficiency, not the necessity of the outcome, made the thing itself clean or simple. Dale Mercer had accepted this freight contract with full knowledge of what he was carrying. He had made his decision, and he stood by it. He was not a man who second-guessed decisions that couldn't be unmade, but he was also not a man who pretended the weight wasn't there. He stood up, rinsed his cup, and went back to work. 3 weeks later, in a Vethkai port station on the far edge of the Scaran Nebula corridor, Commander Vrock Seal submitted his formal incident report to the Freebooter Guild Oversight Committee. He had spent the transit home composing it carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood that the document would outlast him, and you'd be read by people who needed to understand something they currently did not. The report was 17 pages long. It covered the tactical approach, the boarding action, the atmospheric conditions, the biological incident, the hull contamination, the negotiations, and the withdrawal. It was accurate, it was detailed, it did not minimize anything. Then they read it again. Then they amended the Vethkai Freebooter Guild's official operational guidelines to include, for the first time in the Guild's 400-year history, a formal prohibition. The prohibition covered a specific category of target. It was listed under the heading, Absolute Exclusion, No Engagement Under Any Circumstances, which was a category previously reserved for Galactic Council military vessels and Class 9 automated weapon platforms. The new entry read, Human vessels of any type, size, or apparent defensive capability. See Incident File VK7741 Mercer for full classification rationale. The file was marked with the highest available hazard designation in the Guild system, a designation that translated, roughly, into Galactic Standard as something between catastrophic risk and do not approach under any circumstances whatsoever. Within 6 months, through the informal networks by which operational intelligence moved across the outer corridors, the substance of Vrock Seal's report had reached 11 other pirate organizations, 4 independent raider fleets, 2 mercenary guilds, and the operational planning departments of 3 minor galactic powers who had been quietly considering whether human crewed vessels in the outer territories were viable soft targets. They all reached the same conclusion. They all updated their targeting parameters accordingly. The Sovereign Reach completed her delivery to the Kepler's Belt Colony Station without further incidents. The cargo was offloaded, logged, and transported to its receiving facility under security escort. Dale signed the completion documents, accepted the freight payment, and filed his final incident report with United Earth Merchant Marine Oversight, who added it to a classified database that very few people had clearance to access and that had over the past decade grown considerably larger than its original architects had anticipated. He took on a new contract 2 days later. Different cargo, different route, same ship. The new contract's manifest listed scientific research specimens, Class B biological, containment certified in the cargo description, which was accurate in the same way that the original Sovereign Reach manifest had been accurate. Technically correct, practically incomplete. Dale read the full briefing documents, as he always did, signed the acknowledgement forms, as he always did the containment checks himself on departure day, as he always did. Then he poured a cup of coffee, settled into the captain's chair, and pointed the Sovereign Reach at the outer stars. Some things about deep space freight never changed. The stars were always cold, the corridors were always long, and somewhere out there in the vast galactic dark, there were always beings who looked at a slow, scarred, unarmed-seeming freighter and thought, easy score. They were always wrong. They were just wrong in different ways each time. Dale Mercer found this on balance to be one of the more reliable facts about the universe. He took a certain quiet satisfaction in it, the way a man does when the world keeps confirming what he already knew. The Sovereign Reach moved through the dark, steady and unhurried, and carrying her secrets with the patient confidence of something that had been doing this for a very long time. Far behind her, in the Scarran Nebula corridor, the stars were quiet. The Vethkai fleet had gone. The breach in the lower port hull was patched and clean. And in Cell 14, behind 30 centimeters of reinforced containment plating, XB-7 rested in its dormant colony state, colorless, patient, ancient, and perfectly content to wait. It had no concept of victory, no awareness of what it had done or what it had prevented. It simply was what it was, a survivor of 400 million years of hostile chemistry, doing what it had always done in the only way it had ever known, waiting for the next meal. And out there in the galaxy, if you want more stories of humanity's quiet, terrifying edge, you're already in the right place. This is HFY Endurance Tales. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to understand what humans really are, and drop your comment below. We are the biohazard. Because the universe is vast, the corridors are long, and we are just getting started.